But it was very interesting, a massive study done in China where they showed that people in their 80s who had exercised when they were in their 30s actually had a better profile. Their brain was much younger than people who hadn't done anything in their 30s. But it's not too late to start.
Emotional events are more easily remembered, to quote Bruce McEwen, that the idea that when you have a little bit of stress or a little bit of emotionality in the consolidation phase, that might increase arousal as well.
Well, I sincerely hope that exercise helps for old people because I'm doing plenty of it myself.
Before we dive into today's episode of the Mental Wellbeing College, an important disclaimer. We do dive into the weeds of mental health, which means that at times we discuss sensitive topics like suicide, self-harm, and substance abuse. If hearing such discussion does bring up distress for you, please do seek the psychological and professional treatment that you need. The content covered in this episode is not intended as a substitute for professional mental health treatment. Hello everybody and welcome back to the show. Today we are joined by Professor Terry McMorris to discuss all things exercise and cognition. Terry is a world-renowned expert in the exercise and cognition research space, and he's published prolifically on the effects of physiological stressors, such as exercise, on cognitive functioning. Terry is an Emeritus Professor at the University of Chichester and is a visiting professor at the University of Portsmouth. In today's episode, we discuss when exercise improves cognitive functioning and when it might actually decrease our cognitive abilities, how you can utilize exercise to improve your memory, the role of neuromodulators such as catecholamines and neurotrophins such as BDNF, and their impact on how exercise improves cognitive functioning, whether exercise can help in cognitive decline as we age, including in conditions such as dementia and Alzheimer's, and much, much more. If today's episode of the Mental Wellbeing College brings value to your life, we would be so grateful if you would hit subscribe, follow, or to share this podcast with someone you love or care about. Our mission here at the Mental Wellbeing College is to provide an accessible, evidence-based resource that allows people to take actionable steps in their life, particularly in the way of lifestyle behaviors like exercise, to improve their own mental well-being. And you sharing, liking, and or subscribing to this podcast helps us achieve that mission. Thanks so much for tuning in. And now to our deep dive into exercise and cognition with Professor Terry McMorris. Professor Terry McMorris, welcome to the Mental Wellbeing College.
Thank you very much, Indy. It's very nice to be here. I'm very pleased that you invited me.
Yeah, it's fantastic to have you on. I'm very pleased that you agreed to come on. When I was reading through a lot of the literature in preparation for our discussion, I had a lot of assumptions about whether exercise would have positive effects on cognition. And I found that a lot of these assumptions I've had to check because the literature seems to say there's a lot more gray area and nuance than perhaps I originally thought. So to be able to walk through all that gray area and nuance and all the finer details with an expert like yourself is very much appreciated. So let's start with the effects of acute exercise on cognition. So we're talking a single bout of exercise. What kind of effects does a single bout of exercise have on cognition broadly?
Well, as you say, it's not as simple as it seems to be. When I did my PhD, I really thought that I would do these experiments and I would prove it was an inverted U effect. Everything would be wonderful. I'd get the Nobel Prize. We couldn't, we couldn't go wrong. And of course, what I found is it goes very wrong. There tends to be a positive effect of moderate intensity exercise. But when we get on to heavy exercise, severe exercise, it's very, very different. But we've now, very recently, Professor Hideaki Sawyer from his university they're showing that even very light exercise can have a positive effect, which surprises me, and we can talk about that a bit later. But the inverted U was what everyone was really on about, and interestingly for Australians, it was two Australians who really developed it. Colin Davey, who I believe was an outstanding Aussie rules footballer,
Okay.
and I met him, and he certainly looked as though he could have been an Aussie rules footballer.
Big, tall,
And
rugged type, was he?
oh yes, he was very tall. um, he found an inverted U effect. Um, And one of his colleagues at Victoria University in Melbourne, uh, Cooper, developed the catecholamines hypothesis for this, and said it was down to the role of catecholamines, and really did a very good literature review, and everybody just kind of accepted that's what it was. Me being one of the ones in particular, I thought, yeah, that's it. That's what it is. But now I'm finding it's nowhere near as simple as that. Um, you, do you want me to explain the catecholamines hypothesis?
Well, yeah, let's get to that. But I suppose before we do the inverted U theory, can you tell us just a little bit more about that for those who haven't come across the inverted U effect or hypothesis of exercise on cognition?
Well, it goes back to 1908 when two Americans, Yerkes and Dodson, uh, put 8 little mice into mazes and had them search for food. And they got when they went wrong, they got shocks of different intensities, and they found that when the shocks were mild, it the mice took ages to find the food. When the shocks were moderate, they were very quick. But when they were really severe shocks, again, it took them a long time. And so they developed this idea of the inverted U, that moderate stress was negative, heavy stress was negative, but moderate stress was positive, and low and heavy was weak. And when you look at the way catecholamines work in the brain, they show an inverted U effect on performance as well, and that was what Cooper was looking at. So that was the way it was done, and everybody was doing it, but not always finding those results. Far from it.
Mm. So the initial theory being, yeah, like you said, that moderate stress is kind of the best level of intensity, or moderate exercise intensity is the best for cognitive function in terms of at least one bout of exercise, and too intense or too light exercise can actually impair cognitive performance comparative to a moderate intensity bout of exercise. So you mentioned or alluded to it there that that's not quite the case. So what does the data actually say based off your newer reading?
Yeah, I mean, to a large extent, the moderate intensity exercise does improve performance. It's the But sometimes you can improve performance without uh, without exercise. I mean, we would. I mean, I went for a walk before we started this because I believe in it. But I mean, we don't go and do exercise before we go and do exams, which would be the sensible thing to do if it's really true. Yet we can still perform well. So you can, through willpower, through motivation, you can improve. But there is a definite advantage for moderate intensity exercise. From from heavy exercise, though, it's really equivocal, and you'll find somewhere there was positive things, somewhere there was negative, somewhere nothing happened. So it's the heavy exercise that is the issue.
Mhm. Do you have a sense of what might be moderating that effect, of under what conditions intense or heavy exercise might be better for cognitive function than others?
I think first of all the exercise has got to be really severe. It's got to be high level exercise.
Mm.
There's work by Legise who looked at the respiration compensation point, the point where you are when you're exercising, the output and the input are not the output is too much for the input, and he found a negative effect then, and I think we have to go to that. But even then, there is evidence, mostly though from animal studies, but there is evidence to say there are mechanisms which can override the negative effects. You know, when we talk about the catecholamines, I'll explain those in more detail. But there are some mechanisms which we are only just really finding out about. Very much the work of Aston Jones and Cohen, who did a lot of work in this area. And the same applies to other stressors, hypoxia and heat and cold, etc.
Yeah, okay. And yeah, you mentioned an important point there about the catecholamines and potentially the catecholamine threshold being a point as to which cognition changes as a result of exercise intensity. So, for the uninitiated, can you tell us a little bit about what catecholamines are and their impact and their role in cognition?
Yeah, catecholamines. The catecholamines are dopamine, noradrenaline, sometimes called norepinephrine, and adrenaline. Um, the main ones are dopamine and noradrenaline, and they are neuromodulators. So they modulate the effect of the exercise on the brain, and we need them peripherally. We need them to so that we can keep so that we when we exercise, but we also need them for everything else. We need them for cognition very much. And the idea of the early researchers was when you exercise, we can see there's an increase in catecholamines in the periphery, but they don't cross the blood-brain barrier, and that's where the problem rises. But there was work done by Mishishita and Williams, which showed that although they don't cross the blood-brain barrier, they can activate uh, adrenoceptors in the in the well in the spinal cord, which then activate neurons which pass electrical signals across the blood-brain barrier to the brain stem, and that leads to activation of adrenoceptors within the brain, and so you get an increase in adrenaline and dopamine, and but particularly noradrenaline and dopamine in the brain, and that increases the potential for the brain activation. You're at an optimal level, and 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 it affects them there. And we know that it's linked very much to cognition. We know that when levels of adrenaline and dopamine are low in the brain, you get a slow tonic firing, and it doesn't stimulate. When you give someone a cognitive task, it's not stimulated. They can't deal with it. As you increase the tonic level, then there's an increase in dopamine, and you get phasic firing as well as tonic firing. Phasic firing is when you react to the stimulus, and you respond to the stimulus. Then, as you go on, you get the greater the increase in tonic, it makes there is too much noise in the brain, and that stops the firing, the phasic firing. But the phasic that's the nice little theory. But when you look at what's happening in the brain at that stage, it doesn't really stop the phasic firing, but it disrupts it. So we did one experiment where we found that the main scores on the cognitive task didn't change when at maximum level compared to moderate level. But when we looked at the each individual standard deviations for that, we found that sometimes they were getting very fast correct answers. Sometimes they were getting no answer at all. Sometimes it was really slow. It's disrupted. We disrupt that activation, and it's just. But there will come a point where the exercise will be just far too much, and we only see that. We see it sometimes in marathon runs where you see these people staggering about. Everything's gone, their body's gone, but so has their brain. They think they're running, they think they're doing well. They're actually causing themselves problems. But that is, and you get it even more so with some other stressors. Um, people suffering from sleep deprivation will quite often just lay down and go to sleep in inappropriate places. So there is that real. It's a total disruption of what's happening. So the tonic goes in a straight line, but the phasic is in an inverted U effect.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. So I think firstly, in terms of catecholamines, I think a lot of people might associate them with, say, just reward or motivation, particularly things like dopamine. But adrenaline, noradrenaline, dopamine all have effects on arousal and attention, which can obviously then impact cognitive functioning at the time. Hence, the idea being some level of arousal and indeed catecholamine increased concentrations in the brain can help with these cognitive functions. So that's the idea. But in terms of, if we come to the phasic and tonic firing, right, you mentioned marathon runners. I've never run a marathon in my life, and I don't intend to run one anytime soon. What about in terms of more your average Joe? If I'm going for like a 100-meter sprint all out, or if I'm doing 200-kilo squat on my back, so high intensity in that sense, does that change the signal to noise ratio negatively as well?
Well, the literature's really mixed on those, but there is, the more intense it is, like you're saying, like real severe resistance exercise, um, flat out work seems to have an effect, but it can be very short in those circumstances. You can recover quite quickly, and it would depend when you actually have to make a decision. It's more the effects are more over 10-15 minutes of exercise at a fairly high level. So that does make a difference.
All right, so that's good, and it's certainly. I mean, it doesn't provide black and white answers, but yeah, I suppose that's going to be the theme of our conversation. Is there's a lot of, again, grey area and not many black and white answers. I think the word you used, equivocal, is going to come up a lot in our conversation, Terry. But one of the potential moderators is the interoception model. Can you run us through a little bit about that and tell us why that might impact the effect of exercise intensity on cognition?
Yeah, the interoception it wasn't really discovered as such until 1906, and yeah, Sherrington won the Nobel Prize for his finding of interoception. And what they found was that when you start to exercise, the feedback from your body. Well, no, we start before that. When you make your mind up, you're going to exercise and you're going to do it. You get feed forward to the motor cortex from the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to the motor cortex and to the insular cortex, saying, "Look, this is what it's going to feel like. This is what it's going to be." You then start exercising, and you get feedback from obviously from the muscles through the somatosensory system, but you're also getting feedback from your heart, your lungs, your respiratory system, the smaller muscles around around the respiratory system and such like, and their feedback uh, into the to the lower centers of the brainstem, and in the brainstem they activate adrenoceptors, which then in turn activate the locus ceruleus, which is at the base of the brainstem, and it's only the size of a pea, but it does all sorts. It's really powerful, and that triggers off the release of dopamine. But it also there is feedback to the insular cortex. So the insular cortex knows how you should be feeling, and it compares how you should be feeling with how you are feeling, and then that passes on to the anterior cingulate cortex, which does very similar job. Then they pass upwards through the orbitofrontal cortex into the into the to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and so you're into the real brain areas. You're into the areas where you're actually doing some work, and they also have links with the striatum, with the basal ganglia. So you've got those links with motivation. So you've got an effect on motivation. You've got an effect on cognition. You've got an effect on how well it behaves, and it tries its best to keep homeostasis. It wants to stay the same. It wants output and input to be equal, and that's what it strives for, and that's what a neuromodulator is really. And but what you get, I think this might explain the role of catecholamines and dopamine and noradrenaline better, is that when you when you have moderate intensity exercise, you activate dopamine D1 receptors, and they dampen all neural noise. So anything that's not important, they dampen it down. You activate alpha 2A adrenoceptors, which which will stop you from responding to things that are irrelevant, but leaves open the correct answer. And so that's what you're aiming for. When you're at the lower levels, they don't work together properly. When they're at the higher levels, what they end up doing is dampening out all neural activity. And with rodents, you see you see that, well, they freeze. They will just freeze. They will just stop. And we don't really get there with human beings in a sense, but we do in some situations. Pardon me. In some situations, we do. So it's that interaction, and dopamine is not just motivation. It's involved in everything, and one of the areas is emotion, and emotion plays a big part. But it's dopamine and noradrenaline working together that that produce the brain activity, and they seem to do that best following moderate exercise. So uh, you asked about how are there mechanisms that can stop it, that can modulate that at maximum exercise, and we never thought there were, and that was what the problem was. Dan Kahneman, probably my hero, one of the greatest psychologists there's ever been, he said it wasn't possible. But we know now from work that he didn't have available, from scanners that didn't exist when he was doing his research, and we we know that around the locus ceruleus there's an area which is called the pericerulear zone, and it's a lot of it's a dendritic zone, but it's a dendritic zone for GABAergic, inhibitory gamma aminobutyric acid neurons, and that we think calms down what is happening in the brain, and it modulates it, attenuates it, brings it down, and that allows us to to work better. Maybe it's not work perfectly, but to work better. But there's also things like endocannabinoids and beta endorphins, which also do a similar thing. And no one has ever, as far as I know, no one has ever measured their effect on cognition. We've measured it on emotion, but we haven't measured it on cognition. And yet it's comparatively easy to do because that does cross the blood-brain barrier. So it's a very complex thing. It's like you were saying about there's no black and white answers. You know. I mean, we're dealing with the most complicated thing in the universe, the human brain, and so we're not going to get, we're not going to get the nice answers I thought we would
Yeah.
get 30 years ago. And the, you know, there's a tremendous. If people want to look up Humphreys and Ravel, 1986, they did a model of the effects of stress on the brain, and it's the most fantastic model because there are more arrows on there than there was at Custer's Last Stand and the Battle of Little Bighorn. There are arrows going all over
Jeez.
because there's so many things affected. So many things affect how
Mm,
we want to do it. And
yeah.
my big argument with interoception is, I think interoception, we are constantly comparing what is going on, what the insular cortex is telling us. It's constantly with what's happening in the body, and the anterior cingulate cortex and the orbitofrontal cortex are constantly monitoring how you feel and how you're doing with the cognitive task, and they're feeding back to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and saying, look, uh, do we keep going? Are we happy here, or do we stop? And where I think it is going on is, you're saying, how difficult is this? Have I got the resources to do it? Am I fit enough? Am I clever enough? And what's the reward? What's the reward? If the reward isn't big, well, I'm not going to do this. If the reward is big, I might keep on working at it. So that's where I'm going with interoception, and it's very similar to Hugo Critchley at Brighton, who does a lot of work in this area. So there's a lot in that. There's a hell of a lot there. So you might want to break it down and ask me
Yeah,
things
well,
that.
yeah. Let's see if my understanding is correct, and feel free to correct me if I'm oversimplifying what is a very incredibly complex area and indeed model. So the interaction between my perceived ability to deal with the demands, so the exercise itself, for example, and the perceived rewards, questioning, is it worth it? Those three, ability, demands, reward, kind of interact. And if the conditions are met, then high intensity exercise might actually improve cognitive performance, depending on the interaction between those factors. Is that accurate, or am I way off
Yeah,
it?
no, no, that's accurate. That's very accurate. I mean, it's more likely not to have a negative effect than to improve it, but it could improve
Okay.
it. And there is
Okay.
one other thing, is that is, we sure that it improves if you decide that it's too much, and you're not going to keep on doing that task. The severe exercise seems to be very positive in allowing us to search for alternatives. So I mean, in exercise, we would probably just stop, but we might not. We might slow down. We might do something else. We might do a different kind of exercise. So that's another possibility. But maybe I shouldn't have said that, because that's even more things coming into it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, no, that's really certainly interesting and a lot to stew over. And I think, like, for anyone wanting to really deep dive into this, certainly I'd recommend your book, Exercise, Cognition, Interaction, Neuroscience Perspectives, which I'll link below, because this is certainly how. I've learned an immense amount in the past few weeks just reading through that, and like that's as deep a dive um, into exercise and cognition as I've ever seen in your textbook. So I'd certainly recommend that.
Well, I've written the interoceptive model. There's this paper in 2021 International Journal of Psychophysiology where that I wrote, and I think there's a lot in that. But in the book, yeah, I had some very good authors writing for me in there. There's some excellent people.
I think I read that paper you're referring to as well. I'll link that, and also your chapter with Joe Corbett. I think in Henning Buddha's and Mirko Wegner's book as well was excellent. So I'll link that as well. But if Terry, we're talking now, let's move a little bit towards learning and memory, if we may. So I am particularly interested in understanding how exercise might augment consolidation of learned material. So let me clarify this. Doing my PhD at the moment, do a lot of reading, but I get frustrated sometimes. All the peer-reviewed articles I read, all the wonderful textbooks like yours that I read, sometimes I find that I can't retain that information. So in terms of long-term memory, consolidation of material that one has just read and initially learned about, what role or what do we know about the role of exercise there? Does it help? Does it hinder?
Henrietta van Praag she found that using rodents, she found that exercise increased the amount of brain-derived neurotrophic factor in in the brain, and she showed that if you exercised it in the period that you are consolidating the memory, that that would have a very definite effect. And that makes a lot of sense because in order to develop a long-term memory store, you've got to start with long-term potentiation. So and that's developed. There's early long-term potentiation, which requires brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It requires nitric oxide, which are provided in the exercise. The exercise will induce them. You then need to that lasts for up to about 4 hours. Then when you go beyond that, you need to develop late long-term potentiation, which means that you will need brain-derived you will need noradrenaline for that, and you'll need a fairly high amount of noradrenaline because you have to activate the beta adrenoceptors, which are the least have the lowest affinity. So you need quite a lot of circulating uh, uh, noradrenaline to do that. And we know that forms connections between synapses and dendrites, between synapses and dendrites and axons, and we know that goes on. What happens when you go when you develop that into memory engrams? It is a little bit. People are not quite sure exactly what happens. Different people have different ideas, but it's something similar to the long-term potentiation. So yes, that increase will definitely help, and it's there. And there's probably other neurotrophins as well, insulin-like neurotrophin and vascular endothelial neurotrophin. They almost certainly help, but they are so difficult to get to. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor crosses the blood-brain barrier, so we can say, yeah, we've got an increase. The others, it's really controversial. Rodent studies say, yeah, rodent studies like really sort of say, yes, there's a massive effect, and there's an effect on of the other growth factors. But as I saw one quote once where it said, a monkey, and a monkey's not a human being. And I thought, well, yeah, that's very obvious, but it's worth thinking about. but I think I believe strongly that it does have an effect, and we can look at that with the effects, the chronic exercise with the effects of fitness, for example. That fitness is a help, and that's that's just because you have got more brain-derived neurotrophic, or you've got more brain-derived neurotrophic factor mRNA. That builds up if you exercise intensely. You build up the mRNA, so the potential is there when you need it. Um, so, I mean, I know my own when I learn things, I quite like you. I read them, and I can't, and then I go out for a walk well, it used to be a run. It's a walk now, but I go out for a run, and I find I don't think about it. I just go out, and then I find right that's helped later on, but it's down the line from the exercise. So so you might be nearer to remembering the things than you think.
Hello everyone, a quick break from today's episode. At the Mental Wellbeing College, we are committed to the goal of communicating evidence-based wellbeing strategies out to the broader community. The goal of this podcast is to bridge a gap between self-help material and peer-reviewed research by providing evidence-based discussion that respects the nuances of psychology but is digestible for all audiences. Ultimately, I hope that you as a listener feel empowered after each episode so that you can take away and implement strategies to improve your own mental well-being. If you have gained value from this episode of the Mental Wellbeing College, I would be so grateful if you were to hit subscribe or follow, or to share this episode with someone that you love. This is how we continue to grow the show, get the message out, and to impact people in need by providing such information and strategies. Thanks so much for tuning in. It means a lot to us here at the Mental Wellbeing College. And now back to today's episode. Yeah. It's interesting, and the application of that, like you said, exercising immediately after you've learned something or done some deep focused work. It's something that I'm playing around with. And as I understand it, there are a couple of trials that you referenced in your book, one by, I think, Bernard Winter, where they had people do high intensity exercise after learning new information, and their recall was better after doing high intensity exercise than it was resting or doing low intensity exercise. And they hypothesized that potentially adrenaline, I think it was actually, and dopamine were mediating this effect. So it seems like there's a little bit of work directly testing this, and some of it does point to exercise post-learning helping in recall of information.
Yeah, there's the winter work, and there's Dean Griffin in Dublin. She's done some work. There's someone else whose name I've forgotten. But they're only, with humans there's only so very few. Uh, but with animals it's really strong. With the rodents it's really strong. Uh, but it's difficult to know because we're not really measuring what's happening in the brain a lot of the time. I mean, that's one of the, as far as noradrenaline is concerned, adrenaline, there's, it's there are ways that some people argue that are indicative, they're biomarkers of what's going on in the brain, in the cognitive areas of the brain. We can talk about that later on, but it's the winter studies and the Griffin studies. The brain derived neurotrophic factor, yes, it crosses the blood brain barrier, so yeah, they can say there was an increase in that. But they're going on peripheral measures uh, for the catecholamines, and you can't really do that. I mean, I've done it myself, so I'm not being critical just of them. I've done it, but it's just not worth doing, really. But there are things you can do.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So let's double click on that, because I'd love to know what would be the best way to experimentally uncover or to see whether exercise in the consolidation period immediately after learning information, like hypothetically, what would a really rigorous experiment look like to be able to test, does it help, does it not?
I mean, you can measure brain-derived neurotrophic factor peripherally, so but you've got to remember that it does do jobs peripherally as well. But you can measure that. You could look at metabolites of noradrenaline and dopamine. So if you measure the metabolites, methoxyhydroxyphenyl glycol and homovinylic acid, if you measure them, they give you some idea what's going on in the brain. But the thing that people are looking at now are pupillometry, so measuring changes in pupil size, which are arguably uh, indicative of what's going of changes in the brain. You can use salivary alpha amylase, which obviously you get from saliva, which is supposed to be a biomarker, and with EEGs you can measure P300 amplitude, which again is also arguably. So you could say yes, there's something going on in the brain, and obviously, of course, things like functional near infrared spectroscopy. See if there's increases in the brain. But those they're controversial. They um, they're not controversial if when exercise is not involved. In studies, in non-exercise studies, it's really powerful. They work. But for some reason, there's some controversy in exercise studies. But there's so few exercise studies that have done that. Um, Idiako Soya has just published a paper in Neuroimage in which he used pupillometry and it worked perfectly. Um, but so personally, I think it probably does work. It's just that maybe the sample sizes weren't big enough. I mean, that's a real thing that bugs me, and I've been going on about that um, for quite some time, and we need bigger sample sizes, but it's difficult. Isn't it? It's difficult to get subjects. It's difficult to get people who want to do it, and people who want to do it. But we'll have to see about that. But it is a problem.
Well, you mentioned one mechanism there in terms of BDNF, this kind of brain fertilizer, which helps neurogenesis and long-term potentiation and thus the neurobiological mechanisms of learning and memory. What about the idea of just increased arousal, like physiological arousal, and does that why exercise might work immediately after learning something in terms of it's not necessarily the exercise itself, it's increased arousal and in particular, does this tie into the idea that emotional events are more easily remembered, to quote Bruce McEwen, that the idea that when you have a little bit of stress or a little bit of emotionality in the consolidation phase, that might increase arousal as well. And that's the kind of common mechanism there.
Yeah, because the increase in catecholamines is an increase in
Mm.
arousal. I mean,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
that's what it is. So no matter what you do, whether you do exercise, whether you in the heat or the cold, or you get an increase in arousal. It's an increase in catecholamines. It's there, and that's and so that is to a large extent what it is. But that increase in arousal is affecting um, the, the cognitive areas of the brain, the emotional areas, and all the areas of the brain are getting affected. But yes, I think it is the only thing that yeah, I mean, obviously you have to get the learning part right as well. And I mean, there is an argument that if that in the acquisition phase, if you of learning, if you've exercised before, your arousal level will be higher, so you'll be concentrating higher, and that could help the consolidation phase because you're starting at a higher point. A lot of students don't they'll go and do the exercise, but they won't do the learning bit. So they don't get any better. But but you have to do both. And but I think that is a bit. There's some good work on memory, but there's as you probably find out, there's a lot of work on memory that's not as simple as it. Every time it gets more complicated because there's more things involved.
Yeah. Well, it's a very fascinating area, and I'm keen to see how this landscape continues to evolve. But one area in this landscape that is getting a lot more attention as well is the chronic effects of exercise on cognition. So when you do exercise for a certain amount of weeks, months, years, does it help cognition, and in particular, does it change or delay the age-related impacts on cognition? And when you go to its extreme, we're talking things like cognitive impairment, dementia, Alzheimer's. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on long-term chronic exercise on cognitive functioning and impairment over a long period of time.
Well, I sincerely hope that exercise helps for old people because I'm doing plenty of it myself. Um, So, so yeah, I think we are saying we now begin to realise that long-term exercise over a period of time it increases the mRNA for BDNF as we've already said, but it does for noradrenaline, it does for dopamine. We are well, it does tyrosine hydroxylase. It does not noradrenaline, dopamine, but tyrosine hydroxylase, which is the precursor of the catecholamines. And we're seeing it in lots of other things. Now, if that's building up your over a period of time, it's building up your 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 gene pool, then it's got to have a positive effect. We also know that it slows down the aging processes in the brain. We know that neurogenesis is protected longer. And so it really looks as though it does have an effect on even on these pathological situations. But quite often there it's difficult that people get to a point where sometimes they just can't do the exercise. But it's very interesting, a massive study done in China where they showed that people in their 80s who had exercised when they were in their 30s actually had a better profile. Their brain was much younger than people who hadn't done anything in their 30s. But it's not too late to start. You can start. And I've seen anecdotal evidence. Gentleman who lived next door to me who had Parkinson's disease, who he exercised as long as he could, and I think the quality of his life was really good until it was like it got beyond that. He was quite old then. But so I think with aging it does. I don't think it's just aging. I think there's other aspects. We said Parkinson's disease, uh, but it's like the other. There needs to be more to be done. But there's arguments for schizophrenia and and other bipolar disorder and the rodent models are really saying, yeah, it does affect, and it does look like that with humans as well. So I think it does, but again, we need more research, but it's hard to get the money.
Well, yeah, I'm hoping that there's certainly more funding being thrown towards this area, though, because certainly with an aging population, I think global rates of dementia are expected to triple or double to triple by 2050. So Certainly an area that needs more exploring, as we don't have a cure for this right now as we speak. But it seems like, just scanning the literature, there's several longitudinal and prospective studies showing that people who exercise more at time point one and they follow up with them 10, 15 years later have less cognitive decline, less risk of having a diagnosis of dementia, even when you control for certain confounders at time one. So it does seem like, yeah, exercise may be neuroprotective for a range of these neurodegenerative diseases.
Yeah, I think that. I really believe that. I think that's the case. But they say we need more definite evidence, and we need longitudinal studies, like you say. But with that can only come if governments are willing to put the money in, and if they've got aging populations, and the cost on health services is huge, and they could limit it if they put some money in at the right times. But that's politics, and it's there all over the world. It's a problem.
No, hopefully a space that will certainly reap and attract more and more investment. Terry, it's been, yeah, fantastic to cover what we have. We've covered a lot so far, and I'm very grateful for that. Is there anything in particular that you would want to share with listeners? Any final kind of pieces of wisdom or advice for listeners?
Yeah, well, I just think that when we need to we need to know more about what's actually happening in the brain. It's very, very difficult because obviously we can't stick needles in the brain, and well, we can, but we don't want to. Um, so, but I think we've got to look at these things like pupillometry, like uh, P3 amplitude and such like. We need to look at those and see if they really do work, and we need good experiments with plenty of of participants. The other thing is that we talked before we started this about a lot of the tests, the cognitive tests that we are using, they're very old. A lot of them are very old, and whether they really stress the brain in the same way that that people are stressed in reality is another matter. We talk about executive functions and as though there was something that were really, really difficult. But just because something's an executive function doesn't mean it's difficult. And there's huge learning effects in some of them. So I think we need to develop more complex tasks. I saw a good one in a hypoxia research where these people um, had combined inhibition of preportant responses with withholding information in long-term memory and revamping information over a period of time, and they got some very interesting results. But I think we and just I'd like to see more people looking at the effect of acute exercise. I mean, I'm not in a position anymore to do uh, research on my own to lead it and that, but I am involved with people at Shenzhen University and University of Mississippi, and with Portsmouth and Chichester, my own two universities, and like if anybody listening in wants to discuss anything or wants any help, or I'm more than willing to do it, and I enjoy it, and I've got all day to do it in. So which well, it's unfortunate when as you get older you get more time, but you haven't got the other things that you can do. You can't draw you can't draw on the people to go and collect the data for you. But it is interesting. And what I think things like this, when I started out, 30 years ago, there was a handful of us doing this, and and we got to know each other, but this is so much better, and there's so much more going on. I'm just amazed. One time I knew everybody who was doing it, and now I'm seeing new names all the time, and I'm really pleased. I'm delighted because I think it's got places to go.
Well, I can hear you certainly want the best for the field, and you're certainly happy to see other, pioneers emerging through and other researchers coming through. And you mentioned as well, if there's any researchers out there wanting to potentially collaborate with you or get advice from yourself, and I'm sure there will be, because this podcast gets a lot of traction, particularly from psychology-based students here in Australia. And I think I'll certainly be messaging you, Terry, as I look to embark on some of these studies myself. So yeah, I appreciate your offering there, but also all the wisdom that you've offered on the podcast today. It's been fantastic to learn from you. Thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode of the Mental Wellbeing College. If you've made it this far, it means you've gleaned a ton of value from today's episode, or you've fallen asleep. I sincerely hope that it's the former, and if it is, I would be so grateful if you were to hit subscribe, follow, or to share this podcast with someone you care about. Our mission here at the Mental Wellbeing College is to provide a free and accessible resource for people to take action and implement to improve their own mental wellbeing. And you subscribing, following, and or sharing helps us to achieve that mission and to impact people in need. Thanks so much for tuning in. It means a lot. We'll see you next week on the Mental Wellbeing College.